Hi everyone, good evening. This is Juandano here. Today we are going to talk about uses of language testing or purposes of a language test. Now that we have learned the several criteria of a good language test, now it's time to know how we are going to use the language test. Are we going to use it to master the general ability of someone in using the language? In that case, we are talking about proficiency test. Or are we going to use a language test in order to place students to appropriate levels? In that case, it is a placement test. It is used for placing the students to an appropriate level of class. Or are we going to use it to identify the difficulties that the students are facing in their learning? Then it is a diagnostic test. Or are we going to use it as a measure of how much the student has learned from our course? Now that is a achievement test. Okay, so now let's dive into my presentation and we are going to learn further about those four purposes of language tests. Okay, people, this is the topic for today, uses of language tests, or you can say the purposes of language tests. So there are several purposes or several uses of language tests. We are going to talk about four of them. The first one is proficiency. Now you look here that the main aim of the proficiency language test is to measure one's language abilities regardless of what he or she has learned. Yeah, so the word regardless here is important. For example, TOEFL, IELTS, TOEIC, even HSK, yeah, those are all proficiency language tests. Yeah. This kind of test does not care whether the test taker has studied English for several years or things like that. So if you take a proficiency language test, for example, TOEFL or TOEIC, it really doesn't care whether you have learned English for several years, whether you have taken English courses or TOEFL preparation course, for example, or TOEIC preparation course. It doesn't really care. It is mainly concerned with how well you use the language, how well you use English, how well you can speak it, how well you can write in English, how well you can read English, how well you can listen to English-speaking people. That's it all cares about. It doesn't really measure the mastery of your courses, the courses that you have taken. Yeah, it really doesn't care about that. So it only wants to measure how good he or she is in using the language. That's the main purpose of a proficiency language test. It wants to measure how proficient someone is in using the language. Thus, it does not really care whether the person has finished courses that span several months or several semesters in that language. Yeah. Okay, now that contrast that with achievement test. In achievement test, the test aims to measure how much a student has learned or has achieved in a given language course. Now, this is important. The word has learned or has achieved is important. Typically used in classes. So this test is typically used in language classes. This test is concerned with what a student or test taker has learned in a particular language course. So see, in contrast with proficiency test, now achievement test really measures what the student or what the test taker has learned in a particular language course. So it is quite related to the content of the course that she or he has been taking. Yeah. It wants to know whether the students or test takers have really mastered the lessons. So achievement test, as the name implies, is very much concerned about how much the student has achieved, how much the student has learned in a given language course that she or he has been taking. Okay, that's the difference between proficiency and achievement. Of course, there are more basic differences, like the content of proficiency test does not reflect the content of a language syllabus or a language course. Now that makes sense because they don't really care about the language classes, right, or language courses. In contrast, achievement test is very much associated or related to the language syllabus of a course or the content of courses, the content of a language course, because it wants to measure how much the student has learned from that course. So there's another difference there. Okay. Now the next one is placement test. Placement test aims to assign or to place students to appropriate levels in a course. For example, beginner, intermediate, or advanced. So as the name implies, placement, it functions to place the students in an appropriate level of a language course. If you are an owner of a course or a director of academic matters, you will use this kind of test in order to place the new students to the appropriate levels. Suppose you are a director of a language center, somebody comes to you and she wants to take an English course in your place, then you give her a placement test. You want to know, by giving the test, you want to know whether she can be assigned to advanced level or intermediate or even beginner. Of course, that depends on the score that she achieves in the test. Okay, that's placement. Yeah. Now the last one is diagnostic. Now diagnostic aims to identify students' learning difficulties. Now again, if you are a language teacher teaching a specific class or specific course, you want to know the difficulties that students are facing in the language or in the content that you are teaching them. So if you are a teacher, you run this kind of test in order to know the specific weaknesses of your students in a particular lesson. Say, for example, you have been teaching a class and you suspect and you notice that they seem to be struggling with articles, English articles. So you create a specific test which makes them produce a lot of English articles, and so you can see at what point they seem to have problems, what types of articles they seem to mistake most. Yeah, so that's a diagnostic. In diagnostic, you want to pinpoint a certain weakness of your students or certain difficulties that they are having throughout a course or throughout a class. Okay, so those are the 4 uses of language tests or 4 purposes of a language test. Okay, now I present you with several cases, 2 cases here. First, you are a teacher and you have noticed that your students tend to use wrong past tense. So you create a test which makes them produce a lot of sentences in past tense in order to pinpoint their problems in using this tense. What type of test is this? Okay. Second one is you come to a German course, a German language course, and the owner gives you a test. She said your scores in the test will tell her what specific level you are best at. What specific level suits you best? Now, what type of test is this in terms of the purpose of a language test? Okay, think about those 2 cases and give the answers to me. Okay. Okay, good luck. See you again in my next episode.